The honourable member for St. Paul's.
Would have expected better, but that's okay.
Madam Speaker, I'm pleased to speak today on behalf of the Liberal Party on today's Opposition Day motion on Shannon's Dream, moved by the member for Manawatugan. Although I have to say that I was disappointed by the gesture that member made at the inappropriate attempt at humour at the beginning of this very, very serious debate. But it also gives me a huge opportunity to thank the people that help me to do my job on a daily basis. The Right Honourable Paul Martin, our leader from Toronto Centre, former Minister Andy Scott, the Aboriginal Peoples Commission, the Aboriginal past candidates, especially Cynthia Wesley-Eskimo, and our Aboriginal colleagues in the Senate. And I also want to thank Daniel Rubenstein and in my office and Rick Tice. This is a huge file, and it is not one that is possible to do in any way on my own. Today's motion is inspired by the courageous words and the work of Ms. Shannen of Attawapiskat First Nation, who raised national awareness of the education gap between the First Nations and non-First Nations education systems, but died tragically in a car accident before she could realize her goal of equal education for First Nations kids. We also, I think at this time, need to applaud the inspiration and tireless work of Cindy Blackstock and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, who thankfully is there all the time, pushing us, making sure we're better. And I have to say, across this country, when people sit and ask, what can I do, to be able to send people to the Caring Society's website, to be able to understand Shannon's Dream, Jordan's Principle, and the First Nations I Am a Witness campaign actually makes people feel that there's something that they can do to bear witness to this in this unfortunate situation where more and more causes across this country are really relegated to the refrain of "see you in court."
On behalf of my Liberal colleagues, I would like to pay tribute to Shannen and reiterate our full support for Shannon's Dream and call for an end to the funding gap for First Nations education. We support the right of every Aboriginal student to a high-quality and culturally appropriate education. To reach that goal, the federal government needs to work in consultation and in partnership with First Nations to, first of all, admit that a funding gap exists, which the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs is refusing to do. Second, cooperate with the First Nations to set up an education funding framework that is based on the needs and real costs of this education. And third, create the structures needed to guarantee success and ensure mutual accountability for First Nations education results.
On the National Panel of First Nations Elementary and Secondary Education concluded there is actually no First Nations education system in Canada. Instead, a patchwork of uncoordinated, unaccountable, and underfunded policies and programs that have failed First Nations students. The panel heard from First Nations about many gaps, including no regular reporting on the educational attainment of the child, poor quality of reporting on learning needs, inadequate or non-existent early literacy and numeracy programs, absence of any meaningful or functioning special needs system, no funding or support for language and cultural curriculum and programs, poor school facilities, including at least 100 schools that are not up to standard in terms of physical facilities and are not safe places for learning. Very limited programs for quality distance learning, limited availability of technology or library support, and significant discrepancies in remuneration, institutional supports, and benefits for school staff, including teachers and principals. Unlike in the provincial education systems, where there is a statutory guarantee for education and funding is based on real costs and real needs, there is no legislation governing First Nations education, and a cap currently exists of funding increases. Within these With these significant gaps, it's no surprise that the educational outcome of First Nation learners on reserve are so unacceptably poor. According to Aboriginal Affairs' 2010 Departmental Performance Report, the high school graduation rate for First Nations students living on reserve was just 33.3% in 2009-2010. The graduation rate actually fell 7% from 2008 to 2009. Par comparaison,
By comparison, 77% of non-Aboriginal Canadians have graduated from high school. The Auditor General noted that at that pace, it would take 28 years for First Nations communities to catch up in terms of education.
lack of educational attainment is directly related to the disproportionately high rate of incarceration of Aboriginal people in Canada. For example, according to the 2006 census, the incarceration rate among Aboriginal young adults in Alberta without a high school diploma and employment was 46.1 per thousand, compared to 2.4 per thousand for those with a high school diploma and a job. A major impediment to closing the gap has been the chronic underfunding of First Nations education, which the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs continues to shamefully deny. For the benefit of the minister, here are the facts. Based on population growth and cost inflation, federal funding for First Nations K-12 education should have grown at 6.3% per year. However, the Conservatives have continued to cap funding at 2% per year. Parallèlement,
At the same time, provincial funding for education from kindergarten to grade 12 has grown by over 4% since 1996. And this has created a funding deficit of approximately $2,000 to $3,000 per student per year.
First Nations has calculated that the cumulated funding shortfall for First Nations education was $620 million in 2009-2010 and $1 billion since 2006. The underfunding does not take into account what is needed for basic services like libraries, First Nations language training, support services like special education, and the development of culturally appropriate curriculum, which are not included in INAC's funding formula for First Nations education. Recent reports by the Senate Standing Committee on Aboriginal Peoples and the Auditor General as well as the National Panel have all called on the federal government to end its systemic underfunding of First Nations education and base funding on real cost drivers. Even the provinces are calling on the federal government to respect its moral, legal, and constitutional responsibilities and provide equal funding. Just yesterday, Don Drummond's report to the Ontario government recommended that the Ontario government should put strong pressure on the federal government to provide funding for First Nations on reserve education that at least reaches parity with per-student provincial funding for elementary and secondary education. This past December, the Senate committee likewise concluded in its report, Reforming First Nations Education, that we believe a new funding formula negotiated by the parties and based on real cost drivers must be developed to replace the current system of contribution agreements. And just last week, the National Panel recommended that the government ensure adequate funding to support a First Nations education system that meets the needs of First Nations learners, First Nations communities, and Canada as a whole, and remarked, it does not seem clear that most First Nations schools do not have sufficient It does seem clear that most First Nations schools do not have sufficient resources to properly support the success of their students. It is important to acknowledge that both the Senate Committee and the National Panel reiterated that funding alone will not solve the problem. It must be accompanied by steps to build a new First Nations education system centered around a jointly developed First Nations Education Act. For this reason, the National Panel recommended the following steps be taken immediately in the upcoming budget, with a new funding formula coupled with new standards of accountability for expenditures and results is developed. Increase education funding for the 2012-2013 school year by an amount equal to the percentage increase for provincial schools. increase teacher and administration compensation to a level equivalent to provincial schools in order to recruit and retain educators, make an immediate investment in the early literacy programs. My Liberal colleagues and I agree completely with the need to immediately lift the 2% cap, and we will be looking to the upcoming budget to see if the Conservative government is upholding its stated commitment to improve First Nations educational outcomes. The minister's remarks that the National Panel's recommendations and timelines are merely aspirational have put this commitment into question. This reminds me of the government's position on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which states clearly in Article 14 that Indigenous people have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages and in a manner appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. That Indigenous individuals, particularly children, have the right to all levels and forms of education of the state without discrimination, and states shall, in conjunction with Indigenous peoples, take effective measures in order for Indigenous individuals, particularly children, including those living outside their communities, to have access, when possible, to an education in their own culture and provided in their own language. While the Conservatives endorsed the declaration in November 2010, after initially refusing to do so, the government has since made clear that it views the declaration as, I repeat, aspirational. In a reply to a recent order paper question I submitted, the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs wrote that Canada endorsed the declaration without the intention of creating legally binding obligations, and that the declaration does not give rise to any requirement to undertake specific reforms. I surely hope that the minister's use of the term aspirational does not indicate that the government intends for First Nations education reform to befall the same fate as the declaration. Getting back to the need for funding reform, Liberals also strongly support the recommendation that any new funding formula must abandon the old model of grants and contributions in favour of multi-year statutory funding based on real costs that is predictable and sustainable. This would not only respect First Nations jurisdiction and the government-to-government relationship between the Crown and First Nations, but would undoubtedly create stability and improve outcomes. There's also need to be dedicated funding for First Nations on-reserve educational infrastructure. The impetus from Shannen's dream was the struggle for Attawapiskat to secure funding for a new school to replace the existing portables located on the site, contaminated by a spill of over 50,000 litres of diesel fuel. While the federal government repeatedly issued tenders for the construction of a new school in Attawapiskat, after years of delay, there are 100 other communities with similar needs. Without appropriate infrastructure funding, the gap will surely remain. There have also been recommendations to create an accountability and reporting framework to assess improvements, a national commission to support education reform and improvements, and the creation of regional First Nations education organizations.
Today, while this House is discussing the right to education for First Nations citizens, we need to remember that investing in education is not just a question of self-reliance for Aboriginal communities, but also of performance for Canada's entire economy. Canada is facing a critical shortage of skilled labour, which will increase with time. First Nations can and must play a role to reduce this scarcity, but this will happen only if we work with the First Nations to close the gap. The Centre for Studies on the Standard of Living has pointed out that raising educational levels and outcomes for First Nations will contribute $401 billion to our GDP, increase government revenues by $5.8 billion, and reduce government spending by $8.4 billion over a 25-year period. Especially in northern and remote communities, access to high-quality education will mean that more Aboriginal people will be able to take part in developing our natural resources and other projects.
Liberals have recognized both the right to education and the economic imperative of education. We have strongly supported the need to work in consultation and partnership with First Nations to dramatically increase the level of education attainment. Our party collaborated with Aboriginal people to create the Kelowna Accord, which, among other things, provided $1.8 billion in new targeted funding for education over 5 years in order to raise First Nation outcomes to a level equal to the rest of Canada. While today's debate is largely about First Nations K-12 on reserve education, we also need to address First Nations post-secondary education, as well as the barriers facing Métis and Inuit in achieving better educational outcomes. In terms of post-secondary education, the 2% cap on post-secondary student support program is a significant barrier to increasing the number of status Indian and Inuit students receiving a post-secondary education. The need for more investment in post-secondary education is clear. In 2006, only 8% of Aboriginal people had a university diploma, as opposed to 23% of the general population. In addition to post-secondary education, I learned in a recent meeting with the Association of Canadian Community Colleges that there is a great demand for additional investment in academic upgrading programs so that Aboriginal Canadians who have not graduated from high school are able to do so later in life. Regarding Inuit education, the recently released National Strategy on Inuit Education report, First Canadians, Canadians First, identifies the factors behind the Inuit education gap and recommendations for the way forward. The federal government also needs to work collaboratively with its provincial and territorial counterparts to ensure that there are Métis-specific educational programs. Before I conclude my remarks, I would like to share with members a letter written by a young First Nations boy named Wesley, who contributed to Our Dreams Matter Too, an alternative report from the Shannen Dream campaign to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child on the occasion of Canada's 3rd and 4th periodic reviews. Wesley wrote, "I'm writing this letter to you as a young Native man with something to say about my education. I have attended kindergarten, elementary, and high school on reserve, and I'm aware of the differences between the education that I have received and the education that non-Aboriginal off-reserve students have received. That lack of funding is a concern. The lack of resources is a concern, but the lack of cultural content in our school is the biggest concern for me. If we had more funding, there would be more possibilities to include cultural activities. If we had a better sense of culture, we would be more confident, which would lead to success in life. I would like to see Native Aboriginal students treated and funded the same as any other non-Aboriginal students, because we are all students. We are all human. We are all equal and should be treated as such. I would urge all members to support today's motion. We have lost 6 very long years in improving the educational outcomes for Aboriginal students in Canada, but it is never too late. We know what must be done. All that's left is political will to do not only what's right in terms of fairness and equity, but what's right in terms of securing Canada's economic, social, and cultural future. Ending the underfunding of Aboriginal education is where we must begin."
Comments. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Marcorel-Fortin. Madam Speaker, if education for First Nations was something that could come from speeches, then they would have the best education system in the world. But the problem is that it is not through rhetoric, it is not through talk, but rather through funding. We have not achieved the outcomes we need, and this has been going on for many years. Over the past 25 years, there has been underfunding of this system. Everyone is responsible. We are all responsible. We have not managed to convince people that when budget cuts were imposed, they should not affect teaching and education. I am not pointing the finger at any particular party or person, but I want to know today whether people are willing to walk the talk, whether the Liberals, for example, are willing to deliver the goods.
Member for St. Paul's.
Oui, merci
Miss, thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague for his comments. It is very important to stop blaming people and to start providing these children with what they need. That is what is important. In the budget coming up in March, we can look to genuine investment to help Aboriginal children and students.
Already, it's been 6 years and things have just gotten worse. It's time to push reset now, look to the future, and make sure that the discrimination stops.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs.
Well, we appreciate the ex post facto wisdom of the member here, but the reality is that 6 years ago, in addition to water and sewer matters on reserve, the state of health program delivery and its infrastructure, and as we are speaking thematically today, education, were a mess, frankly, Madam Speaker. And hundreds of schools either needed to be severely rehabilitated or replaced, or in some cases, some communities needed a school for the first time. When I became the MP, there were schools that had, at least in one instance, that had burned and had not been replaced by the previous government. So, Madam Speaker, my question is clear for the member here in these regards. Is she willing to concede today that over the 13 years that the Liberals were in power, that hundreds of schools had been neglected, that there was not an objective framework to prioritize the replacement and rehabilitation of these schools? That's it, Madam Speaker. Yes, sir.
The Honourable Member for St. Paul's.
Thank you very much. What I will acknowledge is that our government worked in realized that the present system wasn't working and that there needed to be a partnership between First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities with the provinces and the territories and the federal government. We worked for 18 months on a plan that then was named the Kelowna Accord. We booked $5 billion into that accord that was actually in that fall economic statement. I know that this government tore up that accord, pretended it never exists, has taken it down off their website, even though you can go and look at it on the Saskatchewan website, and we have had 6 lost years. I am prepared to say to the member that we will look forward now, but we want to know that there will be money in this budget to be able to do the kind of infrastructure and education rebalance that was in the Kelowna Accord.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Timmins, James Bay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was very pleased to hear my honourable colleague speak on this issue. I am concerned about the issue of the 6 long years. Never be it said in the House that I've given the Conservatives a break on anything, but we're talking about 100 lost years. And anybody who's in my age or older who was a First Nation was taken from their family and put in residential schools. Now, we apologized for that 2 years ago. But anybody younger than me was put in those federal schools that were treated as they were basically dumps with substandard education. And then they turned them over to band schools without funding. So what we've seen is an accumulation of decades of systemic negligent abuse that has gone all the way through Indian Affairs, where the reports have sat on the desks. This was never a priority until children made it a priority. That's what makes this motion different. So I'd like to ask my honourable colleague, rather than go back and forth as to how we got here, Shannen's dream talks about the necessary steps of going forward. Can we, as a parliament in this day and age, rectify the 100 years of abuse towards our First Nation children and say, this is the beginning that we start to march forward?
The Honourable Member for St. Paul's.
Madam Speaker, I meant to and should have acknowledged that member in my remarks, and I will take this time to say that his tireless work on this file in actually working with Shannen and towards the dream is really admirable, and the work that parliamentarians need to be doing. This is absolutely this day to debate Shannon's Stream is an opportunity for all parties to come together to rectify, as you've said, 100 years of doing it badly. And I hope that the member understands that the reference that we had such hope in the fall of 2005 when frankly his party took us down, that we could have actually been able to move on the investments that took place in the accord after that 18 months of work. We have to go forward together.
Order, please. Order, please. There are many people who are rising for question. I'd like to give the opportunity. The honourable member for Prince Albert.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And Madam Speaker, it's such a timely debate. You know, it's unfortunate this debate didn't happen many years ago. You know, I look back and look through the history, and I think what we need to refocus our talk about here is on the kids. This is important for the kids. We want to make sure these kids get the proper education they deserve in a fashion that's accountable and bankable. But you know, Madam Speaker, we've had a situation in the past where government just threw money at it. Closed their eyes at it, closed their eyes, throw money at it. Our conscience is clean. Oh, there's a problem again? Close our eyes, throw money at it, conscience is clean. This has been the Liberals' attitude towards this whole file throughout the decades. Close your eyes, throw money at it. Don't worry about accountability. Don't worry about where the money's going to go. Don't worry if it actually gets to the kids and the education. We'll just throw money at it. That doesn't work, Madam Speaker. And I think the member would recognize that those type of policies are days gone by. We need policies that work with the First Nations people directly, that actually achieves the goal in a partnership with First Nations. Will she not recognize that the policies of throwing money at everything do not work, and that accountability, but having, more importantly, partnerships with First Nations to achieve the results that we require for our kids so that they participate in the economy in the future, have to be one that's done in cooperation with First Nations and one with accountability and a process that makes sure it achieves results. Will she not recognize that, please?
Member for St. Paul's.
I will be the first one, Madam Speaker, to admit that the paternalism of the past has not worked at all. That doesn't work. And the reason that the process that was involved in the Kelowna Accord was to build bottom up with First Nations, Inuit and Métis, was to build a system of accountability that actually would work and was implementable and of their own design. In that accord, there was a First Nations Auditor General. There were real targets, but there was also the necessary money. And I think that the member from Timmins James Bay would admit that there hadn't been money put in place for a school. There hadn't been money put in for the infrastructure. And that you cannot pretend that with Tinkerbell dust that we can just wish and this will all be better. It requires serious investments and then serious strategies. What, by when, and how will all First Nations children...
Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands for the last question, but it must be very brief. 30 seconds.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to make it clear that I plan to vote for this motion today, and that the scandal of the treatment of children in First Nations communities, our failure to give them the education they need and deserve. They have a right to a decent education. My question to the honourable member for St. Paul's is very direct and very brief. What does she believe it will take to see this legacy of shame end once and for all?
The honourable member for St. Paul's, 30 seconds response.
Thank you very much to the member, and I think that the exciting thing of having Cindy Blackstock and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, the brilliantly articulated Shannen Stream, people have been thinking about these things for a long time. It's up to us to listen and then to put the appropriate resources there and then to work with the First Nations people on the ground to actually make sure that we are reevaluating all the time in terms of the investments and in terms of the results. And if more money is required to get this kickstart out of the darkness, then we need to be able to see that and have a commitment that will happen in stable, predictable funding that they can count on and that they can plan like any other community in this country.
Resuming debate.